Some stories don't begin with a birth or a death, they begin with a question that refuses to stay buried, long before modern historians learned to doubt their own certainty. Greene County, Ohio carried a quiet secret in its soil. In the brittle winter of 1888, official records listed the death of a man named Caesar Bowen, whose age the ledger claimed without hesitation was 126 years. His birth, noted in a hand darkened by time, belonged to the year 1762, when the Ohio frontier was still an unnamed wilderness under the far-off reign of King George. It was a number so outrageous that scholars would later dismiss it with a scoff. But there were 7 notarized affidavits, 7 signed by wealthy, long-respected citizens of the county, each swearing they had known Caesar since their childhoods. They remembered him as ancient even then. The coroner who inspected his body wrote something strange in his report: bone density and dental wear inconsistent with any living person in my experience. And yet, he refused to challenge the age. No one wanted to look too closely. For more than a century, academics quietly shelved the case in archives that few dared revisit. But the real fear began not with Caesar's impossible age, nor the witnesses who remembered him before their parents were born. It began with what the county found inside his cabin after he died. There, stacked in uneven piles beside a crooked stone fireplace, lay 63 journals, each written in 3 distinct handwritings, all apparently his own childhood scrawl, midlife precision, trembling elder script pages upon pages of memory spanning not only his life, but lives he should never have been able to recall. And so the question lingers, like a breath on cold glass. How long can one life truly last? Whose memories can a single soul carry? To understand that, we must go back, far back to the world. Caesar claimed he was born into Dote, Ohio, 1880s. Greene County was a place of calm respectability then, a quilt of rolling farmland stitched together by dirt roads and whitewashed fences. Everyone knew their neighbor's business, or believed they did. The county seat, Xenia, had clawed its way back from a tornado that tore through it like a vengeful hand in 1874. The railroad had returned commerce to its veins. They were abolitionists, proud ones, still speaking of the Underground Railroad as if the secret routes lay warm beneath their feet. And 2 miles from town, half swallowed by a stand of ancient oaks, sat a crooked cabin that locals insisted had stood longer than the oldest grave in Woodland Cemetery. The cabin looked as if time itself had leaned against it too many times. Logs darkened to near black, roof shingles pinned down by river stones, smoke-stained chimney leaning in a way that suggested it hadn't decided whether to fall or keep standing. This was where Caesar Bowen lived, most days. Townsfolk saw him making his slow way along the road into Xenia. Leaning heavily on a gnarled hickory cane he swore he had cut in 1799. Children whispered that if he stood still long enough, he might be mistaken for an old heap of rags tossed outside the cobbler's shop. His height barely reached 5 feet, his back bent so deeply that the world must have seemed forever angled toward the earth. But his eyes, everybody spoke of his eyes. Clear, too clear, the color of creek water sliding over pale sand. Eyes that fixed on you with a focus so intense grown men felt compelled to look away. He repaired harnesses and tools for a living, working with gnarled fingers that should have trembled with age, but instead moved with the practiced certainty of someone who had repeated the same motions for 100 years. He spoke rarely, and when he did, it was in a voice dry as burlap, threaded with the strange archaic cadence of another century. "Thee must take care with that blade," he'd whisper, or, "Thou wilt break it, if thou pull a so." Wooden tools and old books understood him better than most people. Dr. Harold Sutton, the town physician, a man who trusted science more than scripture, had tried for 3 years to examine Caesar properly. "The man's vitals are impossible," he murmured over dinner to his wife in 1887. "Pulse near 40, breath shallow asleep, yet he walks and works. I've read every medical text published in the last century. None describe anything like him. Perhaps he is simply healthy for his age, his wife suggested. That would be comforting, Margaret. But if the records are true, if he truly is 125, should not be enough to explain this. Dr. Sutton wasn't exaggerating. The courthouse records, preserved through reorganizations and disasters, contained a manumission document dated July 4, 1826. Freeing Caesar, Negro man, aged approximately 64 years. It stated he had been in the Hawthorne family since 1784. Purchased then as an adult Negro of significant years. If one worked backward with even the most forgiving math, he should have been born around 1762, but documents were only the beginning. What stunned the doctor most were the stories Caesar told, stories he should never have been alive to witness. He remembered the Stamp Act riots. He remembered Pontiac's rebellion. He remembered winters, so cold trees cracked open at dawn. He remembered summers, when forest fires turned the sun, the color of dried blood. He remembered a world that belonged to a country still unborn. One young reporter from the Xenia Gazette, Thomas Fletcher, had interviewed him in 1885, expecting little more than pleasant, grandfatherly tales. Instead, he left with a cramped hand and an ink-smudged notebook, furious with details, names, dates, memories too sharp, too painful, too real. "What do you remember most clearly from childhood?" Fletcher asked him. Caesar had sat quietly for so long, the young man worried he had fallen asleep. The fireplace lay cold behind him, though summer heat pressed against the walls, yet the cabin remained unnervingly cool. Finally, Caesar whispered, "The smell of drying tobacco leaves. The golden lines of light through the barn walls. Voices at night, told songs from a place none of us remembered, but still somehow belonged to. And hunger, always hunger." When the reporter pressed him on the changes he had witnessed across such an impossible span, Caesar's gaze had drifted into some distant place. "I saw empires rise and fall," he said. "I saw slavery spread across this land like sickness, and I saw it die. But the strangest thing, Mr. Fletcher, is that I remember all of it. Every crying child, every whip crack, every moment of joy or grief. And memories, they are stones. They collect, they weigh down the chest until breathing becomes a decision." Most of these statements were cut by Fletcher's editor too dark for a small-town newspaper, he claimed. But the full transcript remained in Fletcher's private papers, waiting for the historians who would one day reopen this mystery. And the mystery deepened. For in October of 1887, Caesar stopped speaking altogether. No illness, no injury. He simply opened his mouth in the middle of a sentence and nothing came out. His neighbor, Samuel Pritchard, swore that the old man's face changed in that moment, as if he had suddenly remembered something terrible he had spent a century trying to forget. He refused help, pointed to the door, and sat in silence for 3 months. When he finally spoke again, it was only because fever had dragged him into delirium. Names spilled from him, names unknown to anyone living. He begged forgiveness from ghosts. He apologized to the dead. He whispered, "Tell them I tried. Tell them it was never supposed to be this long." And then, when Dr. Sutton asked what he remembered, Caesar whispered something that chilled the physician in a way no winter wind ever could. "I remember the middle passage. Doctor, I remember the hold of the ship, but I was born in Virginia. So why do I remember Africa? Why do I remember dying more than once?" Dr. Sutton's pen froze. For the first time in his medical career, he could not decide whether his patient was delusional or describing something the doctor had no language to explain, and the unexplainable had only just begun. It was the winter that seemed intent on swallowing the world whole, when the doctor finally realized that Caesar Bowen was slipping toward some threshold no living man had crossed before. Snow piled against the crooked walls of the cabin, until the structure looked half buried, as if the earth itself were trying to reclaim him. The wind pushed down the chimney with a low moan that rattled at the hearthstones. Inside, the air hung thick with the faint smell of fever and old wood. On one of those brittle mornings, Caesar opened his eyes with the slow awareness of someone waking from a lifetime-long dream, not a night's sleep. His gaze moved across the room, taking in the doctor's haggard face, the frost-touched window, the faint plume of breath rising from his own lips. "How many years has it been?" he whispered. "Since what?" Dr. Sutton asked gently. "Since I was young," Caesar said, as though the answer were a knife he feared to touch. He closed his eyes again, slipping back into silence while the cabin groaned around him. Something had changed. His voice had returned. Yes, but it came fractured, fragile, as if each word risked shattering into dust in the days that followed. Reality itself began to warp around him. On a Tuesday afternoon, Dr. Sutton entered the cabin and found Caesar staring so intently at the wall that the doctor followed his gaze, expecting to find something carved into the timbers, some insect, a shadow, anything. But there was nothing, only wood darkened with age. When Caesar finally turned his head, his expression held a terror too profound for a mortal moment. The doctor recoiled not from Caesar himself, but from the unmistakable sense that the old man had seen something no living eyes were meant to perceive. His fear vanished just as quickly, replaced by calm resignation. Dr. Sutton could not understand how a body so frail could hold such extremes. Children in town, emboldened by winter nights and their own hunger for the strange, began inventing stories. They whispered that Caesar spoke to unseen visitors through the walls, that if you walked past his cabin at night, you'd see his silhouette seated in the chair, but his shadow stretched in a direction that didn't match the lamplight. They said he mouthed words no one could hear, as though answering those who had already passed on. One neighbor, Martha Huta, widow with a spine harder than oak, claimed she heard singing rising from the cabin one night. Not Caesar's voice. Multiple voices, woven harmonies in a language older than the land beneath them. Yet when she mustered the courage to open the door the next morning, Caesar sat alone, dozing in his chair. Something was happening to him, something beyond illness or age. Then came the night the snow hammered against the window, so loudly it sounded like fists. Samuel Pritchard woke to frantic banging on his door. When he opened it, Caesar stood barefoot in the snow, nightshirt clinging to his trembling body, eyes wide with a fear that did not belong to this world. Before a word could be exchanged, he collapsed. They carried him inside, and for 3 days Caesar burned with a fever severe enough to kill a stronger man within hours. He thrashed in the bed, sometimes with the strength of someone decades younger, sometimes with the helpless trembling of a dying child, and always he spoke, not in coherent sentences, not to the living. He called out names of the dead: Abigail, Jonas, Scipio, Delilah, Samuel. Names. He could not have invented names, spoken like confessions. "Tell them, I tried," he gasped once, eyes open but seeing far beyond the cabin ceiling. "Tell them it was never supposed to be this long." On the 4th day, the fever dropped. He opened his eyes, as though awakening from centuries of sleep, looked directly at Dr. Sutton, and whispered, "I should have died with the others on the crossing." The doctor grew still. He did not need to ask what crossing. He knew. "The Middle Passage," Caesar said. "But I was born here, born in Virginia. I never made that crossing. So why do I remember it?" His voice broke. "Why do I remember the chains? The dark, the smell? Why do I remember Africa, when I have never seen it?" Dr. Sutton tried for a rational explanation, but his words rang hollow even to his own ears. "Memories passed down. Stories told to you, no." Caesar's eyes locked onto his, with sudden, startling clarity. "These are not stories. They are experiences. I remember them like my own." His voice trembled. "I remember dying, Doctor, not once, more than once. And yet, Still I am here. Something in the room shifted, then something invisible, yet undeniable. A feeling like a veil thinning, like the world drawing breath. Caesar's voice softened. I think I have lived long enough to know that God's justice does not always look like mercy, and I think I am forced to carry more than my own life. In the weeks that followed, Dr. Sutton made his visits almost daily, not out of professional obligation, but a kind of frightened fascination. Each time Caesar drifted between clarity and confusion, recounting memories from multiple lives, as though they were chapters in the same book. And then one afternoon, while the wind rattled the window panes like impatient knuckles, Caesar said something that broke open the doctor's skepticism completely. I remember a ship, he whispered. He shook his head slowly. But I have never set foot on one. Dr. Sutton set his pen down. Describe it. Caesar's eyes filled with a distant, terrible knowing. There is no air, he said. Only heat and bodies. The chains bite into my ankles. Someone is singing. Someone is dying. Children crying in the dark. Sweat, blood. The ocean pounding above us like God's heartbeat. He clutched his chest suddenly, and fear that has a taste. His voice thinned to a thread. I say we, though this was not my memory. It belonged to someone who died long before I was born. Someone who had no name left in this world. He leaned back, exhausted. How many others live inside me, doctor? How many memories are not mine? For the first time in his professional life, Dr. Harold Sutton felt the ground of science shift beneath him. It was around this time that a visitor returned to Xenia, the reporter, Thomas Fletcher. He brought with him stacks of letters, sent from strangers, who had read his small article years earlier. Most were harmless curiosities, but 3 letters changed everything. 1 spoke of a slave named Caesar who had lived on a Virginia plantation in the 1790s for intelligence and eerie predictions of weather and crop yields. Another spoke of a dying man in Delaware in 1850, deliriously calling out for Caesar, begging to confess to him before death. The third, the most unsettling, described a woman who had helped a fugitive named Caesar in 1823. An old man even then. Fletcher read these aloud in the cabin. Caesar listened in stillness, the shadows on his face deepening. I remember them, he said softly. All of them. He touched the letters with trembling fingers, as if touching memories made flesh. I was there. I was them. I carried pieces of them forward. Fletcher's pencil stilled. You're suggesting? What exactly? Caesar looked up. His eyes had never seemed more ancient. That the years are not entirely mine, he said, and perhaps neither are the memories. He turned toward the window where the wind pressed against the glass. There was a woman, he said, when I was small, so old she seemed carved from the bones of time itself. She survived the ships. She survived everything. He closed his eyes, recalling. She looked at me and said I would carry the weight of my people, that I would remember what others could not, that I would witness what should have been forgotten. He drew a breath so weary it sounded like centuries cracking. A curse, the doctor whispered, or a blessing, Caesar murmured. In this world, they are often the same thing. And so the truth began to take shape, not fully formed, not yet spoken aloud, but rising, inevitable, like a tide. Something had been done to Caesar Bowen, something that bound him to more than one life, something that stretched his years beyond nature, beyond reason, something about to reach its terrible climax. Outside, the wind shifted. The trees leaned, and inside the dark cabin, a man who had lived too long braced himself for the moment when all borrowed lives would come calling. The last true thaw of that strange winter came quietly, as if the world were holding its breath. Snow shrank back from the trees, revealing earth that had forgotten warmth. Birds returned hesitantly, their songs thin, uncertain, but inside Caesar Bowen's cabin, The season changed differently. The light itself seemed altered, dimmed, not by clouds, but by something, gathering in the corners like unspoken memory. It was Martha Hoot who first noticed the physical transformation. She arrived with a basket of bread and broth and froze in the doorway. "Doctor," she whispered, "something's happening to him." Dr. Sutton moved toward the bed, and the change struck him at once. Caesar's skin, once deeply furrowed and leather brown, had thinned to an almost translucent veil, as though time were erasing him stroke by stroke. Blue veins traced delicate maps beneath his flesh. His eyes, once the pale brown of creek water, now carried a cloudy sheen. Not blindness, but something else, like smoke behind glass. His frame had narrowed further, bones pressed sharply beneath skin, and yet his presence seemed larger, as if a crowd lived behind his ribs. "How do you feel?" the doctor asked. Caesar's voice drifted out like wind passing through dry reeds, hollow. He lifted a trembling hand, studying it as if it belonged to someone else. "I can feel pieces of myself unraveling, not painfully. It's gentler than you'd expect, like threads being pulled from a tapestry, one by one." "Is it the fever?" Fletcher asked. "No," Caesar said. "It's time." He let his hand fall to the blankets. "I am becoming less of a man and more of a memory, and memories don't need flesh." For a moment, no one spoke. The only sound was the pop of a distant icicle falling from the eaves. Then came May 3rd, the day the impossible became undeniable. Dr. Sutton entered the cabin just after sunrise. The air was warm for early May, but a coldness clung to the interior of the cabin like breath on a crypt wall. Caesar sat rigid in his chair, wide-eyed, every line of his face strained. His breath came in small, frightened bursts. "Tell me what's happening," the doctor urged, rushing to his side. "They're here," Caesar whispered. "Every one of them." His gaze swept the room toward empty corners. Empty air, yet his expression was that of someone watching a crowd approach. "All the ones whose memories I carry. They're gathering, pressing in, surrounding me." Dr. Sutton saw nothing, but he felt something, a weight in the room, a thickness in the air, as if gravity itself had deepened by a subtle degree. "Please," the doctor said gently, "describe it. It's like I'm being opened from the inside." Caesar's voice cracked. "Their faces, their deaths, their childhoods, all rising at once. I can't separate them. I can't tell where I end and they begin." His head tilted sharply, eyes following shapes none of them could see. "Lydia," he whispered, "her children. She wants them back." His voice shifted higher, trembling. "Joshua, I feel the lash. God help me, it hurts." Then deeper, raw. "Delilah. She lost everything, and I feel the loss as if it were mine." Fletcher's pencil slipped from his fingers. "It's not him speaking," he said in a shaking voice. "Not just him." Caesar's voice shifted again, this time into a tone none of them recognized, feminine, sharp with youth. "I'm 12, he said. "No," she said. "My back burns. I'm hiding from the overseer. Mama, don't cry." Dr. Sutton felt his heart hammering. Every medical instinct screamed at him to categorize this as delirium, but his mind fought back with every piece of evidence he had witnessed. This was not delirium. This was something collapsing under the weight of too many selves. Caesar's body jerked once. His voice became rough, aged, as if dragging every syllable from a throat crushed long ago. "I'm running," he choked out. "Forest. Branches tearing at my arms. Blood in my mouth. North Star. Keep looking at the North Star." Another change, soft, broken. "I'm dying," he whispered in a voice that made Martha clasp a hand to her mouth. "I'm dying in a field I never left. I never saw my children again." And then, abruptly, silence. Not the silence of exhaustion. Something deeper. Like the room itself. Pausing, Dr. Sutton whispered, "Caesar." But the old man did not answer. He stared into the corner of the room into Nothing. And yet his eyes filled with the recognition of someone seeing a familiar face. They want their time back, he murmured. Their deaths, their voices, their memories, they're all returning to themselves. And I am being unmade. He shuddered. I can feel. Every year I borrowed pulling free of me. The next 3 days were a descent into a kind of haunting that had no place in the world of the living. Caesar spoke in dozens of voices, old, young, male, female, accents from coastal islands, from Virginia tidewater, from Maryland fields, voices cracked with grief, voices humming lullabies, voices whispering prayers to forgotten gods, voices screaming. The cabin became a place no one wanted to enter alone. On May 5th, Dr. Sutton sat in the boarding house, writing in frantic looping script. He is not one man. He is many, held together by a center that is collapsing. I do not understand the mechanism, but I understand the truth. He is dying the deaths of dozens. That night he returned to the cabin to find Caesar asleep peacefully, impossibly peacefully. And the next morning, something changed. Caesar woke with clarity in his eyes, true clarity, like dawn breaking after a month of storms. I owe you both an apology, he told them, for what you've seen. No man should witness the unmaking of so many souls. Fletcher swallowed hard. Tell us what is happening. I am returning what was never mine, Caesar said. One by one, they are leaving me. The ritual that bound them is unraveling. Then you'll be free, Fletcher asked. Caesar smiled, not with joy, but with something gentler. I will be myself again, and then I will be nothing. Nothing, Martha whispered from the corner. Caesar looked at her with so much tenderness that her eyes filled with tears. When the memories are gone, the ones that kept me walking long after my own years ended, my time will be finished too. His breath trembled. It is not death that frightens me. I have watched it too many times. What frightened me was being trapped alive, but drowning under centuries of memory. He paused, gathering strength. But now the water is draining. For hours, Caesar spoke in his own voice, only his own, telling stories from his childhood, real stories, personal, untouched by others' grief. His mother's singing, the cold barn where he slept, the taste of stolen corn mush, the first time he understood what it meant to be property. When evening came, he grew quiet. There will be one last storm, he said. One final gathering. After that, I will rest. And he was right. The storm began the next night. It was no storm of weather. It was a storm of voices. At midnight, Caesar began to speak again, but not in the fractured way before. This time the voices didn't come in fragments. They came all at once, layered, overlapping, dozens, hundreds. The sound was impossible, multiple tones pouring from one frail body. Fletcher stumbled back in terror. Martha fell to her knees, praying aloud. The lamps flickered wildly. Caesar rose to his feet, though he had not stood in days. His arms lifted, as if called upward by invisible hands. The chorus of voices roared through him, women, children speaking, crying, praying, wailing, singing. It was a sound that did not belong on earth. For 3 minutes, the impossible continued, and then stillness. The lamps steadied. The air eased. Caesar lowered his arms, breath slow but calm. He sank into his chair and looked at the 3 terrified witnesses with quiet, astonishing peace. It is finished, he said. They are free. He closed his eyes, and soon, so shall I be? The cabin felt different after the voices left. For the first time in months, the air no longer pressed on the lungs. The corners no longer seemed occupied by invisible onlookers. The shadows lay where shadows should. When dawn crept through the small window, its light no longer bent strangely, no longer seemed to hesitate at the threshold. Caesar slept. Dr. Sutton sat beside him, unable to close his eyes. Every time he tried, He heard that impossible chorus again, 100 lives shouting through a single throat. Even the most rational mind could not file such a thing neatly away. In the faint quiet of morning, he wrote in his notebook, his handwriting unsteady. If consciousness is a single flame, then I have watched a man burn with many fires at once. I do not know what I have witnessed. I only know I will never see its like again. Around mid-morning, Caesar stirred. He did not jerk awake, as he had during the crisis, did not gasp or flinch. He opened his eyes the way a man opens a door to a familiar house, knowing what lies within. His gaze found the doctor first, then Fletcher, sleeping awkwardly in a chair with his notebook clutched to his chest. "Good," Caesar whispered, his voice rasping but steady. "You stayed." Dr. Sutton leaned forward. "How do you feel?" Light, Caesar said. His lips tilted in the smallest of smiles. For the first time in I do not know how long, as if something has been lifted off me. "The others?" the doctor asked cautiously. "Gone," Caesar answered quietly. "Or freed, or returned, whatever word your science prefers. They are no longer pressed inside my skull. I can reach for my own memories without walking through theirs." He drew a slow breath, savoring it. I had forgotten what it was to be only myself. Fletcher woke with a soft snort, blinking at the light. "Are we?" He spotted Caesar awake and sat up straight. "You're lucid." For the moment, Caesar agreed, "and I suspect we won't have many such moments left, so we should use them." His voice carried a quiet certainty that made argument impossible. "Ask," he said, "right? Remember, that is all that ever mattered." So they did. 4 hours that day. The cabin became a small, fragile court of testimony. Caesar did not speak of rituals, or impossible voices, or the strange machinery of years. He spoke as a man nearing his end speaks chosen memories, chosen regrets, fragments he could not bear to let die with him. "I was born cold," he said at one point, as the morning stretched toward afternoon. "My mother wrapped me in what little she had." She told me later, "I did not cry that first night, only stared at her with big, questioning eyes." She said, "I looked at her like I was already older than she was." He chuckled weakly. Maybe I was. Maybe I had been many things before that cabin in Virginia, and I just didn't remember yet. He told them about the woman who had chosen him, the one he called Emirachi. He described her carefully, the way she'd sit slightly apart from the others, murmuring in a language no overseer understood. The scars along her arms that formed patterns too deliberate to be random. "She saw something in me," he said. "I was small and sickly and likely to die. Perhaps that made me easier to shape. Or perhaps I was just the only one who looked at her without fear. And she changed you," Fletcher said cautiously. "No," Caesar answered. "God, or fate, or the deep currents of the world, whatever you name it, that had already claimed me. She only turned the river into a channel, gave the water walls." He closed his eyes. "She didn't ask," he admitted. "I often wondered if I would have said yes. To carry so much, to live so long, to watch so many die." A pause. "I think I might have said no," he finished softly. "And yet, knowing what has been preserved, I cannot wish it undone." They asked him if he resented her. "I resented everything," he said simply. "The whip, the chains, the laws, the God who watched, the men who counted lives like coin." He sighed faintly. "But her? No, she did not curse me for her amusement. She created a vessel so the tide of forgetting would not wash everything away." He turned to Sutton. "You understand that, Doctor? You cling to your notes like I clung to memory. You fear oblivion just as I did." The physician swallowed, because there was truth in that. On the second day after the great storm of voices, Caesar began to fade. It was visible in small ways. His breaths took longer to arrive. His hands wandered when he reached for the cup of water. Once, His eyes drifted past both men and settled on the door with a curious little smile, as if he saw someone standing there they could not see, but he did not seem afraid. If anything, he seemed relieved. "This is what it is to die as one life," he said quietly that evening, when the pale light of sunset traced thin bars across the floor. "I have seen so many go, but I was never allowed to follow. The door was always closed to me. I knocked, and still I woke the next day." "Do you think you were kept alive on purpose?" Fletcher asked. "By God." Caesar's lips twisted thoughtfully. "If God did it, he owes me many explanations," he replied. "But no, I think it was the work of people, of Amarachi and others before her, work rooted in something older than churches, older than scripture. Work born out of desperation. We will not be forgotten." He turned his head slowly, eyes finding the small stack of leather-bound journals on the table near the bed. "And now," he said, "they won't be." On the third day, he asked to be taken outside. The sky was a clear, deep blue, washed clean by rain. They wrapped him in blankets and carried him carefully, chair and all, into the sunlight. The air smelled of damp soil and budding leaves. Birds argued noisily in the branches overhead. Caesar tilted his face to the sun and closed his eyes. "My mother used to say the sun was the only master she trusted," he murmured. "It rose whether white men commanded it to or not. It shone on slave and master alike. Could not be owned, could not be bought. It just was." He smiled faintly. "I like that." They left him there for hours, the breeze stirring wisps of white hair at his temples, his hands resting in his lap. Sometimes his lips moved, perhaps in prayer, perhaps in memory. Once, he laughed quietly at something only he heard. When the light began to wane, he spoke again. "Do you smell that?" Martha, standing nearby, sniffed. "Lilacs," she said, "from my back garden." "My mother used to talk about lilacs," Caesar said. "Said they grew by the big house on the plantation. We were never allowed close enough to touch them. She said they smelled like a world where we belonged." His eyes opened, bright with unshed tears. "All my life," he said, "the people I carried, they were kept from beautiful things. Trees only for shade while they worked. Rivers only to cross when they were being sold. Skies only noticed when storms ruined the crops they planted. I like to think that, wherever they are now, they have all the lilacs they want." They carried him back inside at dusk. That next morning, the end finally came. Dr. Sutton woke early from a shallow sleep on the chair beside the bed and found Caesar awake, watching him with quiet amusement. "Even doctors must sleep," Caesar said. "You don't have to prove you can outrace death." "It appears you've been doing that for over a century," the doctor replied. "Not racing," Caesar corrected. "Dragged. I have been dragged behind the wagon of time like a loose rope." He took a deeper breath than he'd managed in days, and his tone shifted, growing careful, deliberate. "Doctor, I need a promise from you." "Anything," Sutton said. "The journals," Caesar whispered. "They must survive. They must not be destroyed or buried or hoarded in some locked chest. They belong to everyone who ever lived under the lash, and everyone who needs to understand what that meant. See that they reach people who can read them properly. Historians, scholars, anyone who still believes we were only shadows at the edge of this nation's story." "I swear it," Dr. Sutton said, his voice firm. "On my name." Caesar looked satisfied. "Good. Then I can go with less regret." He turned his head, seeking Fletcher. "And you," he said, "young man with ink-stained fingers, you write as if the world might end if you miss a word." Fletcher smiled faintly. "Sometimes it feels that way. Do not let them smooth this story," Caesar said. His voice, though faint, carried a startling intensity. "They will want to file off its rough edges, turn it into inspiration or spectacle. Don't let them. Let it be as ugly as it was. Let it be as holy as it was." Suffering and courage and cruelty and small kindnesses, in the dark write it all. Thomas Fletcher swallowed hard. I will. Good, Caesar breathed. Then I guess this was not a waste. The sun had climbed a little higher by the time his strength began to give out. He drifted in and out of sleep, though even in sleep, his brow remained smooth. His mouth slightly curved as if he had finally been invited into a joke he'd waited. His whole life to hear Dot around meet it. He woke one last time. Doctor, he said softly, I'm here. Don't let me die alone. That's all any of us ever wanted, I think. Someone to witness the last breath, so it doesn't vanish like it never happened. You're not alone, Sutton said. You have more witnesses than any man I've ever known. Caesar smiled. That's a nice thought. He exhaled slowly, then looked toward a corner of the cabin, the same one he'd stared at during his terror months before. This time his expression was calm, almost relieved. There you are, he whispered. I thought you'd forgotten me. No one else heard any reply. He lay back against the thin pillow, eyes half closed, and spoke in barely more than a breath. We were here. Remember that? We were here. His chest rose. Dot rose again. Dot stayed. Dr. Sutton leaned forward, fingers searching gently at the throat, the wrist, the hollow above the heart. Nothing. He waited not seconds, but long, measured minutes, because part of him refused to accept that this man, who had defied time itself, would simply stop. But eventually, even a skeptic must accept what his own hands confirm. He's gone, he said quietly. Fletcher bowed his head. Martha wept openly, pressing her apron to her face. The cabin, oddly, felt larger, not emptier. Exactly. Just vacated. As if the crowd that had once lived inside one frail frame had finally left, and the room had become too big for the remaining silence. The coroner arrived later that day. Dr. William Hayes was not a man given to drama. He prided himself on a clear eye and steady hand. He'd come prepared to roll his own eyes at the rumors of impossible age. Instead, he left with more questions than any of the others. He examined the body carefully, moving with professional restraint. Bones, teeth, skin, the organs that it carried, blood and breath far beyond any reasonable span. After a long, quiet stretch of work, he straightened slowly. I have no language for this, he admitted, his voice low. Medically speaking, this is the oldest human body I've ever seen. The skeleton alone, the wear, the density. He shook his head. If someone told me this man was over 100, I would believe it without hesitation. If they told me he was older still, I could not prove them wrong. So you'll confirm the age? Fletcher asked. Hayes hesitated. Medicine cannot confirm numbers like one confirms a sum in arithmetic, he said finally. I can say only this. Nothing I see contradicts the records, and much I see supports them. In his official report, he chose his words with care. Subject demonstrates signs of extreme age, significantly beyond typical human lifespan. Dental and skeletal wear patterns strongly suggest prolonged use. No pathology explains the level of systemic degeneration, except chronological duration, while precise numerical age cannot be scientifically confirmed. The documentation listing 126 years cannot be declared unreasonable based on physical examination alone. That was as close as a man of science could come to admitting the impossible. 2 days later, they buried Caesar Bowen in Woodland Cemetery under a sky as soft and gray as old paper. The funeral was small, but not empty. Neighbors came. Curious onlookers came. A handful of elderly black residents came, people who had once been children on plantations, now stooped and wrinkled and free. One old woman approached Dr. Sutton afterward. My grandmother told me about him, she said. Said there was a man who remembered more than any man should. Said he kept the story so he wouldn't disappear. She glanced at the fresh mound of earth. I reckon he did that job. Now it's our turn. The stone they set above him was simple. Caesar Bowen 1762 sampai 1888. Hiram Mbrid. The journals went home with Dr. Sutton. He built a case for them, a solid glass-fronted cabinet in his study. Evening after evening, he opened one at random and read until the candles burned low. Some entries were clipped, factual. Others were raw enough to make his hands shake as he turned the pages. Stories of women watching their children sold. Stories of men whipped for learning the alphabet. Stories of small acts of defiances. Stolen hour of sleep, a broken tool, a whispered song. Stories of escape and failure and survival. He cross-checked every claim he could. Names against property rolls. Events against local newspapers. Places against old maps. Over and over, the impossible chronicler proved correct. In 1895, he published his book. It was not the book he had planned. He had intended something clinical, a case study of extreme longevity. Instead, the manuscript he delivered to his publisher was part medical report, part historical testimony, part confession of a man forced to admit that his understanding of life had been too small. He titled it, The Extended Witness, a Study in Memory, Time, and the Life of Caesar Bowen. The scientific world mocked it. Journals called it sentimental, unrigorous, speculative. Critics claimed the journals must have been compiled over decades by multiple writers, then falsely attributed to one man. Others suggested that Caesar had built a persona based on stories told by countless others, absorbing them so deeply that he believed they were his own. They dismissed the notion of centuries defying age, dismissed the idea of memories crossing from one mind to another, dismissed anything that did not fit neatly within the boundaries they had defined as possible. But Dr. Sutton never recanted. He invited his most vocal critics to come and see the journals, to hold them, to read page after page of handwriting evolving, but never truly changing, to follow dates and names and details that matched reality too often to be dismissed as coincidence. Few came. It was easier not to. Years later, when his health began to fail and his own memory faltered, Sutton wrote one last entry in his private notebook. I could not explain him, he admitted. Perhaps I was never meant to. Perhaps my task was only to witness him, as he witnessed so many others. If future minds, in future centuries, find mechanisms for what I have seen, so much the better. Until then, I stand by what I know. That one man, called Caesar Bowen, carried the stories of many. And that in recording him, I have done something larger than myself. After his death, his estate honored his request. They donated the journals to the Ohio Historical Society in 1904. There they slept. Decades passed. New wars were fought. Machines learned to fly. Cities rose out of cornfields. The world turned its gaze to new horrors and new wonders. The old boxers labeled Bowen. Caesar papers gathered dust on the shelves of an archive that smelled of paper and time. It wasn't until the 1960s, when another generation marched and bled for rights they should have had all along, that someone opened those boxes again with serious intent. A young black historian named Patricia Morrison sat at a long wooden table, gloved hands trembling slightly as she turned pages no one had read in half a century. What she found there was not myth, not miracle, not neat explanation. She found lives, slaves whose names had never been written anywhere else, journeys north that had never made it into official records, deaths that had never been noticed by those who recorded history, and threaded through all of it, the steady voice of the man who had chosen or been chosen to carry them. She verified what she could, names against plantation records, places against maps, incidents against dusty court cases and long-dormant newspaper columns. Again and again, Caesar's words stood firm. In an article she later wrote, She stopped short of claiming he had truly lived 126 years, or that he had somehow absorbed multiple lives, though it was clear she was tempted. Instead, she said this: "We may never know how these journals came to contain so much truth. Perhaps it was one unusually long-lived man. Perhaps it was a compilation of stories, carefully gathered. Perhaps it was something stranger. What matters is that the content is real, that it expands our understanding of the slave experience in ways no single voice ever has. Sometimes it is less important to explain how a witness became possible than to listen to what that witness preserved. As for the cabin, time took care of it. The wood rotted. The chimney leaned until it did what gravity had been asking it to do for years. Children dared each other to throw stones through its broken windows. Some swore they heard humming when they got too close, a sound like many voices singing the same low, steady line. Eventually, practical men knocked the remains to the ground and paved it over for a parking lot. Cars rolled over the spot where a boy once became a vessel, and an old man finally returned what he had carried. But memory is stubborn. It clings to the world in strange ways, in stories, in gestures, in quiet books on forgotten shelves. In the end, whether Caesar truly lived 126 years, or whether some great, inexplicable current of memory moved through him, is almost beside the point. What matters, the thing that cannot be dismissed, is that he chose to spend whatever time he had as a witness, not for himself, for others. He could have tried to forget. Instead, he wrote. He could have turned his impossible longevity into bitterness. Instead, he turned it into testimony. He could have chased comfort. Instead, he chased truth. In a country that tried to reduce him to property, he became an archive. In a world that wrote his people out of its histories, he carved them back in with ink and will in impossible years. If you stand very quietly in certain corners of the archive where his journals rest, some say you can still feel it, that weight of witness, that sense of eyes watching from another time, asking only one thing: do not forget that we were here. And perhaps that is the only immortality that ever truly matters.